The area of northeastern Ohio, northwestern Pennsylvania, and western New York falls into what is known as the Midwestern Snowbelt. This is an area where strong, cold winds blowing across the relatively warm water of Lake Erie bring massive amounts of snow in the winter months. Storms forming off the lake can dump feet of snow at a time on the region, bringing life to a grinding halt for those who call the area home. One such storm, in late December of 1876, was bringing unprecedented amounts of snow. Mounds of powdery white flakes had fallen most of the month, coming in waves each week like a monster stalking the night. As Christmas came and went, travelers were moving about the region, going to and coming from visits with family and friends. While many would discover the difficulty of traversing the covered roads, many more sought a relatively new form of transportation: trains. Passenger rail had only started being used in a widespread basis in the early to mid-19th century, and it was still a rather dangerous form of travel. While it may have been safer than braving the tens or hundreds of miles on foot or horseback, lack of regulation and safety measures meant that accidents resulting in injuries and death weren't uncommon. Coming into the 1870s, more than 400 people had been killed, with hundreds more being injured in at least 11 major accidents involving passenger trains. Many of these disasters would be the catalyst for change in the industry, with new safety measures being adopted and implemented over the years. But none would match what happened on December 29, 1876, during a blinding snowstorm. The scene that night would match what many might imagine the biblical apocalypse to be. Even today, more than 148 years later, few disasters have matched it, and none in the state of Ohio have even come close. The sun was well below the horizon, and a pair of locomotive engines, the Socrates and Columbia, were struggling to pull their load through the onslaught of snow. As the storm raged outside, Marion Shepherd stared out the window of her sleeper car, the Palatine. It was one of 3 sleeper cars meant to shuttle those who would be spending multiple days on the train en route to their destination. Besides the Palatine, there were the sleeper cars known as City of Buffalo and Osseo, trailing along in addition to 2 baggage cars, 2 express cars, 2 day passenger coaches, a smoking car, and a drawing car known as Yokohama. As Miss Shepherd stared out into the night, she thought about her time visiting friends in Albany, having only left there the day before on her way to visit others as she made her way to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The snow, starting as they made their way through Rochester, New York, was slowing the trip down, and she worried she might not have as much time to visit as she had hoped. The train was several hours behind schedule as it plodded along, slowly approaching the next major stop of Cleveland, Ohio. It was due in the Forest City at 7:05 p.m., but thanks to the poor conditions, it was just reaching the small burg of Ashtabula, Ohio around 7:30, an hour and a half or more later than it should have been. As she was just about to lay down for the evening and get some rest, Miss Shepherd was startled by a massive lurch of the compartment, causing a candle on the table near her to fall over. The glass in the lamps that lit the car shattered, and the bell rope used to signal those nearby that the train was moving snapped. As she tried to process what was happening, a man close to her shouted, "Oh my God, we're going down!" Before the final word had reached her ears, she felt gravity pulling as the train car started plummeting. She could barely see the 20 or so other people she'd been sharing the space with in the darkness as she stood up in the center of the car and grabbed hold of the seat in front of her, hoping to avoid the glass and wood that was splintering all around. It felt like an eternity, though it was only a few intense seconds before everything came to a stop. Time stood still as the silence crept in, and Miss Shepherd wondered if she'd survived the crash. If so, had she been the only one? Then a jolt and loud crunch erupted as the train car slammed into the ground below. Screams broke through the cold air, and a second impact, something hitting the car from above, silenced some of them. She fell with the car, something landing on top of her and knocking her over. Pushing the object off her body, she felt a person stumble over her and nearly fall before recovering and moving away. "The car could go up in flames. We need to get out," a male voice said in the dark. Water began flooding into the compartment as she found her footing and tried to find an exit. Crawling was easier than walking, and she could feel people grabbing at her as she moved. People were begging for help, voices in the void pleading for their lives and moaning in pain. All she could do was keep moving. Another woman, desperately trying to free her husband, grabbed Miss Shepherd by the arm and asked for help in lifting whatever was pinning the man down. Try as they might, the two women were unable to free the woman's husband, and a group of men offered to assist, urging Miss Shepherd to exit the car. Finally making her way to the open door, she stumbled out into the night to meet the blizzard head-on. A strange glow flooded the landscape, illuminating the snow and mangle of iron in the gorge. Several of the train cars had started to burn, and the screams of those still trapped inside the wreckage filled the air. Engineer Daniel McGuire had only a second to take in the scene before his senses returned, forcing his arms to act on instinct, sounding the whistle and the train bell in alarm. He'd been almost completely across the bridge when a loud crack grabbed his attention. His engine, the Socrates, was at the head of the train, and he had to act quick as the whole thing lurched backwards. Slamming the throttle, the locomotive shot forward, and for a panicked moment, he thought he'd saved the train. But he'd only prolonged the inevitable, as the connection between the engine and the Columbia snapped. As the Socrates moved up the track, the Columbia sank back with the cars. All Daniel could do was watch in horror as the second engine plummeted into the abyss. He was sure that all of the 160 souls he'd been ferrying had been lost. The sound of the horn and bell blaring through the night was enough to grab the interest of many in the tiny village of Ashtabula, Ohio. The bridge was only about 100 yards away from the small passenger station that sat on West 32nd Street in the town, and many had even heard the crash before the horn sounded. Railroad employees and patrons waiting at the station were the first to make it to the site, but local residents weren't far behind. As they arrived, many sought to help as best they could. There were men going from car to car, searching for any who could be helped. Some began sorting through the wreckage, trying to free those who were trapped. Others stood by in disbelief, too shaken to move and lost in the carnage. Even as the rescue work commenced, a fire was spreading from car to car. It grew with intensity as the minutes passed, and before long it was raging in the middle of the blizzard, sending clouds of black smoke that somehow made the night even darker. Looking out of a bedroom window of one of the homes in Ashtabula, one might mistake the glow in the distance for the rising sun. An orange hue filled the sky, speckled with large snowflakes. But venturing out into the night would reveal the light to be the result of a roaring fire, and the snowflakes were a mix of ice crystals and ash. Even those in the furthest reaches of the village were pulled in by the sight, and the number trying to desperately reach victims was growing by the minute. Means to fight such an intense blaze were minimal, but the town was equipped with a small fire engine. Within moments, horses had been pulled from the barn and hitched to the trailer, urged to drag it where the water within was needed. The deep snow slowed any progress, and a third of an hour would pass before the first firefighting crew had reached the wreck. By then, the flames were roaring like a lion feasting on its dinner. But as citizens of the sleepy town worked side by side with passengers to free those who were still trapped in the wreckage, the fire engines sat unused. Even as the flames enveloped what might have been survivors, the call to use water on the scene fell on deaf ears. "We don't want water, we want to get the wounded," came the shout from the fire chief. No one seemed to be in charge of the mess. Those who could have ordered the hoses attached and used to douse the flames refused to make the call. The fire chief, who may have even been inebriated, insisted that the water would only get in the way of rescuing those who may still be alive. The representative from the railroad, Mr. Apthorpe, was also of little help and didn't want to override the authority of the fire chief. Those attempting to rescue as many as possible finally took up the responsibility of putting out the fire using buckets. They scrambled to gather as many as possible and formed a chain, passing water up and pouring it on the flames, trying to at least prevent the remains of those who'd perished from becoming ash. Even as they worked frantically to pour the water from the buckets, the fire raged on. The engines couldn't be used without orders, and the chief wouldn't give them permission. Argument after argument broke out, with a possible mutiny being held off only for fear that those who would use the engines without the chief's call would be jailed. Late into the night, the flames consumed the wreckage. There was no way to know how many could have been saved as the fire finally started dying. The smell of the bodies, many burned beyond recognition, permeated the air and covered everything in the scent of death. Ashtabula, having a population of about 2,000 people in the 1870 census, did not have a hospital in 1876. There had never been a need for a large medical facility in the small town, and those who needed more than could be provided would find care in nearby Cleveland. As the wounded were pulled from the ruins of the disaster, however, the lack of space proved to be a problem. Initially, the survivors who were unable to dive back into the wreckage to help were directed into a small pump house that sat near the side of the bridge. One by one, the injured were laid on the cold stone floor and treated only as needed. The solution quickly fell apart, and those citizens who weren't actively working on the wreck took it upon themselves to begin moving the wounded. No one knew exactly where to take the survivors, and so the town improvised by moving them to wherever they could find room. Up the snowy hill through the blizzard, those who could stand were helped along, and those who needed to be carried were handed from man to man. But not everyone was there to help. Reports of valuables being taken from the injured surfaced, with thieves pickpocketing those they were assisting. As they were being ushered into buildings like the Eagle Hotel, laid on dirty barroom floors and placed in conditions barely better than the wreckage, they were being relieved of whatever money and valuables they might be carrying. Some were lucky enough to make it onto wooden pallets, or into carpetless bedrooms to lie on dirty beds. Others were moved into houses where room was available, laid on couches or floors wherever they would fit. Spectators filed in, eager to look at the wounded and experience their own version of the tragedy. Surgeons and anyone who had any kind of medical training went to work as quickly as they could. Wounds were tended, dressings applied, warm clothes finally came, and the survivors began the process of healing. As the wreckage smoldered, it became a grave. Snow continued falling and blowing, covering the ruins as they cooled. Even as the fire still burned, however, a few sad souls took to plundering what valuables they could recover. Watches, jewelry, brooches, and more were removed from the dead as the site sat unguarded in the night. Some of the goods would later be recovered, totaling a little over $1,500, thanks to the mayor and local detectives, but an unknown total would be lost forever. Whenever a great tragedy occurs, people clamor for answers. Often these answers leave a lot to be desired, and seldom are they sufficient to ward off the illusion of impropriety or quell the suspicions of those who see connections in every random event. Of course, there is always an explanation, even when that explanation isn't satisfying. The first question on many people's minds in the direct aftermath revolved around the fire. Why hadn't it been doused with the hoses? Why did the firemen fail to act? By the light of dawn, many had already decided the answer. Rumors flew, first through the village, then through the throngs of people who would read about the incident all across the nation in the following days. It was thought by many that the railroad company prevented the chief from opening the hoses. The railroad company would only have to pay out to families of those who could be proven to have been on the train at the time of the accident. As the fire destroyed many bodies, burning them beyond recognition, they would be able to avoid paying many of the victims' families. In the course of time, that theory was proven completely untrue, but not before spreading and becoming so intertwined that it was repeated by at least one witness during the coroner's inquest that followed. Some speculated that water was refused as dousing the fire would cause clouds of hot steam that would impede the ability to rescue those who were still trapped in the wreckage. This theory was also put to rest rather quickly. In the end, the coroner's report cited incompetence in the form of loss of judgment due to the horrible nature of the accident as the reason the hoses weren't used. No one there on that night had ever faced something so appalling, and none of the men in charge were mentally prepared to lead the response. The days following the disaster saw a massive effort to recover as many of the bodies as possible, and any relics that could identify the dead, as the wreckage was removed. Friends and family of the deceased were tasked with identifying the bodies, or in many cases, clothes or items that belonged to their loved ones. The number of dead will never truly be known. Officially, 92 people died in the crash, but that number is only a best guess based on the estimate of 160 passengers and the remains or items belonging to the missing that could be identified. Remains of about 50 people who couldn't be identified, including approximately 22 people who were placed in a mass grave, were interred in the Chestnut Grove Cemetery in the weeks following the tragedy. As the dead were laid to rest, the next big question centered on the cause of the accident. The first thought was that maybe the snow had played some kind of a role. Piled high, perhaps it had contributed by adding weight or causing the train to move slower over the bridge than it usually would. The bridge itself had only been standing for 11 years, having been replaced in 1865 by the railroad company. Amasa Stone, the president of the railroad company at the time, had designed it himself based on an often used bridge design known as Howe Truss. But not content to just use the usual design, Mr. Stone made some changes to the well-known bridge type. One of the biggest changes that he made was to construct the bridge completely out of wrought iron instead of using a combination of iron and wood as was normally done. This caused the bridge to be heavier and less flexible, among other problems. The design was so poor, in fact, that it was rejected by two engineers who worked for Mr. Stone. The first, Joseph Tomlinson, would go on to oversee the construction of the bridge after rejecting the design and resigning his position of engineer. The second to reject it was the railroad company's chief engineer, Charles Collins, who defended any role he could have had in stopping the thing being built by testifying that he didn't think it was his place to say anything when he was removed from the project. The first problem with the structure came before the bridge was even in use. The braces on the ends were placed wrong and had to be moved. It took more than a year to fix that issue, and even when the project was complete, it was seen as more of an experiment than a design for the future. The flaw that ultimately doomed the bridge was in the fact that there was no redundancy in the event of a single failure. Each part of the bridge was designed to support a specific amount of weight, and if any part were to fail, the whole thing would fail. The coroner's inquest also called out the fact that the bridge hadn't been properly inspected during its lifetime, saying that a competent inspection would have caught the defect. Another major problem focused on the stoves the rail company used to heat its trains. A law passed in 1869 required all rail cars in Ohio to use self-extinguishing heating stoves. This simple change would have prevented the massive fire that erupted, which, in addition to possibly saving some lives, would have made the recovery effort much easier. The victims of the accident would number many more than just the dead. The survivors no doubt faced challenges of their own as they recovered both physically and psychologically. The families of the deceased would also have their own burdens to bear as they laid their loved ones to rest. Charles Collins would be found dead in his home on February 8, 1877, of a gunshot wound to his head. It was widely believed he had ended his own life, being filled with guilt at the loss of life the bridge he'd helped construct resulted in. But that narrative has since been challenged. And this is a good time to mention that I also have a podcast called The Long Way Home, which is getting ready to start its second season. In Season 2, I'm diving deeper into the Legends and Tales videos like this one, but in an audio format. And that is where I'll be digging into the theory about Charles Collins being murdered. You can catch The Long Way Home on your favorite podcasting platform, or even here on YouTube, and you can even get early access to episodes of Legends and Tales as well as The Long Way Home over on Patreon. But with the shameless plug out of the way, let's move on. Whether he was the victim of his own hand or foul play, Charles Collins would be the last official victim of the tragedy. Focusing on the future and wanting something positive to come from the disaster, the citizens of Ashtabula would raise money and build a medical center in 1882, with a hospital being erected in 1904 to ensure they would be prepared if another tragedy were to happen. Wherever I can, I try to get out to the site of these stories and capture them as they exist in the present. While many areas change drastically over time, just being on the site of things like the Ashtabula train disaster is a humbling experience. To stand where so many lost their lives, where something so horrific happened, puts the story into a new perspective. So with that being said, I'm going to share this short clip from my trip to Ashtabula, Ohio on December 27th, 2024. So now I'm here in Ashtabula, Ohio, and right behind me, this is the site of the train disaster that happened in 1876, so 148 years ago. And the bridge that sits behind me now, there used to be two concrete abutments that came out on either side, and then they had the ironwork that went between it that held up the tracks. And you can kind of see, I don't know how well it's showing up in the video here, but there is a track that sits across it now at the very top of what is essentially a mound of dirt. And then of course you've got the concrete down below that's holding everything together and letting the water flow through the river. But that all wasn't there in 1876 when the actual train disaster happened. It was just the metal, and that was what had collapsed. And everything in this valley right behind me, this is where the train was sitting. This is where 92 people lost their lives, 160 people total that were involved in the accident in some way, shape, or form. And there was snow covered everywhere. There's a little bit of snow out here now. This is lake effect snow country, so there's a lot of really heavy snow recently. A lot of it's melted away at this point, but there's still a little bit here, and it's kind of sobering and kind of weird to visit the area this close to the actual disaster, because it happened on December 29th, and as I'm recording this today, it's December 27th. So it's only a couple of days before the anniversary of the accident. And so it's kind of humbling and kind of weird to stand out here and see what it is today, whereas 148, almost 150 years ago, this was a much different area, and it was very difficult to get down into the canyon here, into the gorge, where the river's flowing through. You can see where the rivers are still a few feet deep. It's shallow enough in most places that you could probably walk a lot of it, but it's 3 or 4 feet deep, and that's where the train came to rest, caught fire, blew up, and that's pretty much it. So I wanted to kind of do a little bit here at the end of the video and talk and show the actual scene and the actual spot, because I thought it was kind of interesting. I always love to come to these sites when I can, just to show off the history and to show off the difference between modern day and what it looked like back in the past. You've seen pictures throughout the video of what it looked like in the past, or artist renderings. So to see it in real life in the modern day kind of adds that perspective. So I'm going to go ahead and throw it back to myself in the studio. I can't fully put into words what it's like for me to explore these legends and tales, dig into them, and live through the perspectives of those who were there, like I did with Miss Shepherd or Daniel McGuire, and then stand where they stood. In my head, I could hear the crash of the cars as they slammed into the river below, the sound of the train horn and bell calling for help. As we pulled into the parking lot of the Memorial Park, a train running along the modern tracks could be heard, really driving home the gravity of the location and the history. I try to approach these stories with care and reverence, whether they're based in a historical event like the Ashtabula train disaster, or based in deep folklore with little historical basis. And it's through patrons and those who take the time to watch, like, and comment on videos that I'm able to keep going. My goal as an author and a historian is to tell an interesting story and share the truth behind the legend. The people at the heart of the tale are what matter, and I want to share their stories in a way that brings them back to life, if only for a moment. I mentioned my podcast, The Long Way Home, earlier, and I want to take just a second to talk a little bit more about it. There are so many stories to share, and as great as this format is, it isn't the right place to read all of the articles and stories that I want to share when I uncover these legends and tales. An audio podcast is the perfect place to do things like read the full article where Miss Shepherd tells her harrowing tale of survival, or dive deeper into Charles Collins' cause of death. If you like the surface level stories, videos like this one, you can subscribe here and get those when they come out. If you want more and want to dig deeper into the legends, The Long Way Home is the perfect companion. New episodes are going to be dropping starting January 15th, and it isn't just these new legends I'm diving into. I'll be opening up the Legends and Tales vault and going deeper on legends I've covered here on YouTube, going back to the very beginning of this series. So make sure that you're subscribed here on YouTube, follow The Long Way Home on whatever podcasting platform you like most, and let me know in the comments what legend you'd like to see me cover next. Thank you for watching. Everyone have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you in the next one.
If I'm the bad one, take a look at yourself in the mirror. If I'm the worst one, ask anybody else who they prefer. If it comes down to me,